The idea of a guaranteed annual income has been kicked around on both the left and the right for decades, and recently it's come up again at both the provincial and federal levels. But only one place in Canada has ever tried it. Dauphin, Manitoba, in the 1970s. It was called Mincome. What did that experiment tell us about how such a program might work today? Well, Evelyn Forget made a study of that case. She is a health economist and director of the Manitoba Research Data Centre at the University of Manitoba, and she joins us now from Winnipeg. Evelyn Forget, it's good to meet you, and thanks for coming on TVO tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
How did you first become interested in this notion of a guaranteed annual income, the way it was done more than 40 years ago in Dauphin, Manitoba?
Well, I always knew about the existence of the Mincome experiment. Coincidentally, I was an undergraduate in Toronto when the original experiment was taking place between 74 and 78. So I always knew that it existed, and every time I went into an economics class, my professors would explain that there was this wonderful experiment taking place way out west somewhere that was going to revolutionize the way we delivered social programs in Canada. And I graduated and I went to graduate school, and people stopped talking about Mincome, and I eventually got a job in Winnipeg and discovered that some of my new colleagues had in fact worked on the original project. So it was always sitting in the back of my mind, and about 15 years ago I transferred to the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Manitoba, and I was doing quite a lot of work on the relationship between health outcomes and poverty. And I wondered if that old experiment, the Mincome experiment, had ever had an effect on people's quality of life, on their mental health, and on their well-being.
And where was the research that you needed to find in order to look into all of this?
Well, it took me a little while to find the data. I had hoped to find nice databases that I would be able to analyze, and I eventually tracked it down. It was under the control of the National Archives. But when I found it, it was sitting in a warehouse in Winnipeg in 1,800 cardboard boxes. So no database had ever been constructed. It was sitting in paper format. And it's pretty intimidating to look at 1,800 cubic feet of paper data and to realize you have a finite life. Probably you're not going to be able to digitize and do very much with this. And so I went looking for other data sources, and coincidentally, Manitoba had introduced Medicare, universal health insurance, in 1971. So I was able to track the individuals who participated in the experiment in the health database and in the educational databases maintained by the province.
Before we get to what you eventually discovered, Mincome ended in 1978. Why was nothing done with all of that research, all of that data, between then and when you got your hands on it?
Well, it's interesting. The project started, it sort of came out of the wake of a lot of changes that were being made all across North America at the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. There was a sort of rediscovery of poverty, both in the US and in Canada, and a belief that we could do a little bit better. We could do a better job dealing with poverty than had been done to date. The 1970s were a difficult time economically. The project began, and over the period of the project, there were a couple of oil price shocks. Canada suffered significant inflation. And the parties in power began to worry about other aspects of the economy. They were worried about unemployment, they were worried about inflation rates, interest rates, which eventually peaked at about 20% or 21%. And poverty sort of fell off the agenda. And those same economic difficulties also created political difficulties for the parties in power. It was a cost-shared experiment. The federal government paid 75% of the costs, but the province of Manitoba paid 25% of the costs. The Social Democratic government, the NDP, fell in 1976 in Manitoba and was replaced by the Progressive Conservatives, and very few new governments are keen on investing a lot of time and resources in the special projects of their predecessors. So it lost political support, first of all politically and eventually federally.
What were the nuts and bolts of the program? In other words, who was eligible to get it? How did they get it? Just tell us how it all worked.
Well, there were actually two test sites in Manitoba. The town of Dauphin was unique because it was a saturation site, and that meant that all of the families in town received the same promise, and that is that if their income was low enough, if it fell below a predetermined threshold, they would receive a fixed amount of money. As their income from other sources increased, their benefit would be reduced, but it would be reduced less than proportionally. The second site was actually in Winnipeg. A small proportion of the families in Winnipeg were chosen to participate in the experiment, and they were randomized into test subjects and into a control group. And the idea was that the results of those two groups could be compared at the end of the experiment to find out what the consequences were.
And presumably the Dauphin, Manitoba site, a saturation site as you called it, the impact of the guaranteed annual income would have been more significant given that everybody got it as opposed to Winnipeg. Is that fair to say?
That's right. I think one of the things that happens when you have a saturation site, just like when you roll out a project generally, a program generally, there's a lot of interaction between people, and that interaction can either attenuate or it can reinforce the effects of the program. And I think in the case of the guaranteed annual income, it reinforced the effects.
Now let's read an excerpt from the study that you wrote called The Town with No Poverty. This is from 5 years ago. Here's an excerpt on Mincome. We found that overall hospitalizations, and specifically hospitalizations for accidents and injuries and mental health diagnoses, declined for Mincome subjects relative to the comparison group. Overall, the measured impact was larger than one might have expected when only about a third of families qualified for support at any one time, and many of the supplements would have been quite small. This we attribute to social interaction. All right, let's just sort of amplify that a little bit. How did social interaction add to the impact of this guaranteed annual income program?
Well, it's actually easier to explain if I talk about the educational effects than if I talk about the health effects. One of the things we discovered was that there was an increase in high school completion among Dauphin subjects over the period of Mincome. And if you think about a teenager, a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old, deciding whether to go back to school. Legally, they're able to leave school and to take a job. And we discovered by talking to some of the subjects that in low-income families, the boys especially, were under a fair amount of family pressure to become self-supporting as quickly as possible so that the family money could go to the younger siblings. When Mincome came along, a lot of those families discovered that they could afford to support their sons in school a little bit longer. But the child himself, the 17-year-old boy himself, deciding whether to go back to school for grade 12, is going to be concerned not only with whether his family can afford to support him, but what his friends are doing. So it matters that his friends are part of the program.
Interesting.
And so you get that kind of reinforcement. If you think about health, a lot of the accident and injury hospitalizations, for example, that would include things like car accidents. A lot of car accidents are alcohol fueled. So it depends on the level of alcohol abuse in the community, and that depends on how many people are participating in the experiment, what income levels are.
Interesting. So if they had more income, they were less likely to be in unfortunate social situations. Therefore, they might drive and drink less, and therefore fewer accidents.
Fewer accidents, fewer industrial accidents, because they're under a little bit less pressure to stay in dangerous work situations. If you think about farms, they're maybe a little less desperate to get the harvest out of the field, just simply because this program exists as a sort of insurance scheme. You can also, accident and injury hospitalizations are also picking up the effects of family violence. And again, the lack of income is a key stressor for families, which may very well lead to poor outcomes for families.
How about the impact on mental health cases in Dauphin, Manitoba? Could you come to any conclusions about that?
That was a huge impact. It was a huge driver. The actual hospitalizations in Dauphin relative to the control group fell by 8.5%, which is a massive amount. And a large portion of that was due to a reduction in mental health hospitalizations. And I think it has to do with the removal of stress from families. The existence of an income insurance scheme goes a long way towards making people's lives just a little bit easier, a little bit more comfortable.
This program only lasted for 4 years in Dauphin, Manitoba, is that right?
That's right.
4 years. Are you at all concerned that is too small a space of time in which to come to any kind of far-reaching conclusions?
It's always an issue when you run this kind of an experiment. People don't necessarily behave the same way when they know that an experiment is temporary as they would if it were a permanent rollout of a policy. So it's entirely possible that the short-term effects would be either accented or attenuated if it were expanded. I think that in terms of the health and educational effects, I think that the results we saw were very much the effects we would see if there were a general program rollout.
How do you know that it wasn't all just coincidental?
Well, it was actually a fairly sophisticated statistical design. I did create a matched control group. My subjects received the income support, but my controls were as similar to the people in Dauphin as I could possibly make them. So they lived in similar kinds of towns, they lived in similar kinds of families, they were the same age and sex, they were exposed to the other things that might have led to those kinds of effects. So it was the difference between the subject and the control group that's really significant.
You know, I suspect there are plenty of Canadians, perhaps more on the small c conservative end of the economic spectrum, who just can't get their head around the notion of the government paying people money for no reason, right? Yep. I mean, not connected to having to look for a job, not connected to, anyway, all of that thing. You know all the arguments. Yep. What's the argument you would counter with to say, well, I know this doesn't feel right, but it actually makes sense?
Well, I think the first thing I'd remind people is that we're already paying a great deal in income support payments. I think the provinces together are paying a minimum of $15 billion a year, probably more than that, in income support already. And that's not including the administrative costs of delivering those programs. So part of the suggestion is that that same amount of money, differently allocated, run in a slightly more efficient way, might lead to very good outcomes. If at the same time you can expand the amount of money going to those programs, you might come to better social effects. I guess the other thing I'd point to is that most people like to work. Most people given an opportunity will take a job. And in fact, working is a really important aspect of mental health for most people. But work, and the important work that people do, isn't necessarily work that pays enough money to support a family. So if you think of the case of many women, for example, who might leave the workforce in order to take care of infants and young children or older family members who've had health issues, these women are doing important caregiving work, but it's not work that's paid for in this society. It's something worth valuing.
I'm not sure Milton Friedman would be your idea of a hero as an economist. He was, after all, one of Ronald Reagan's economic advisors. But I think he was kind of on side with this idea, too, in a way,
Absolutely.
Was he not?
Absolutely. I mean, the greatest benefit of a guaranteed income is the amount of freedom, the amount of opportunity for individual families to make their own decisions about how to spend their own money. There's far less scrutiny of individual families because you don't have behavioral conditions, because you don't need a bureaucracy to ensure that people are searching for jobs and behaving in ways that they're supposed to behave. It actually becomes cheaper to deliver these kinds of programs, and he was all for administrative efficiency, as he was for the freedom of individual families to make decisions.
Now, there's every possibility that some people in the Ontario government are watching this interview right now, and therefore I'd like you to give them some advice, because in the last Ontario budget, there was one line which suggested that, and I don't think they've picked the city yet, but they wanted to pick a city or a town somewhere in Ontario and do a pilot project on a guaranteed annual income. Now, if that comes to fruition, would you please give them some advice on how you think it ought to be rolled out?
Well, I think that there are a lot of ways that a pilot can be rolled out. I think that the one thing that I would be most interested is knowing what the fundamental question is that they want answered. If you run a pilot, it's usually to determine something. And when Mincome was introduced, the primary reason for introducing it was to find out what the effect would be on people's work effort. Would they quit their jobs? Would they work less? And during Mincome, we discovered that there was very little effect on primary earners, on adults with full-time jobs. But we did find larger effects on adolescents. Those young men who stayed in high school a little bit longer were working less because they were staying in high school. We also found an effect on married women who stayed out of the workforce just a little bit longer when they gave birth. They were effectively using the guaranteed income to buy themselves longer mat leaves. But the question that Mincome was attempting to answer was, how would this affect the labor market? What would be the consequences for the labor market? I'm not sure what the primary question is for the Ontario government. But until we know what question it is that they want to answer, it's very difficult to design an appropriate pilot.
Okay, that's a good point, but let me try a different kind of a question. To achieve all of the things that we've talked about already, better health outcomes, less alcoholism, better mental health outcomes, presumably, I mean, if you look far enough down the road, a need for fewer prisons and all of that, you know, correctional situation. What's the ideal number for a guaranteed annual income, given your look at this thing?
I think that the number people have been talking about in Ontario is a number more generous than individuals currently receive from Ontario Works or ODSP. So I think that they're looking at the guaranteed annual income as a replacement for those adult benefit systems, and they should be somewhat more generous than the existing systems. I guess from my own perspective, I mean, I've done costing at a lot of different levels, and that's ultimately a political decision. But one of the things that you might want to look at is how much money we expect seniors to live on. And currently, if you're over 65 and an individual, the minimum amount of income that you can expect to live on is the sum of OAS and GIS, which is about $16,000 or $17,000 for an individual or $26,000 for a couple.
So guaranteed annual income, you'd want to be a little bit north of that anyway.
I think somewhere in that range, and with appropriate adjustments for family size.
Okay, and as we look down the road, is there any question in your mind, having studied this, that if Ontario as a province or even Canada as a country were to bring in a guaranteed annual income, that I don't know, you tell me how long, 5 years, 10 years down the road, we would start to see changes in the country that would make this thing pay for itself?
Pay for itself. I certainly do think that. I think what we'd see is an attenuation in the growth rates of expenditures for the healthcare system, for example. We know that about 50% of the costs of the healthcare system are driven by the circumstances of your life, which are very largely determined by the income level that you have. Health is the largest expenditure for provinces. It's the most challenging expenditure for provinces. So if we can use a guaranteed annual income in order to make people healthier so they require less health care, then we can reduce the growth rate of those costs. We can reduce the growth rate of, as you mentioned, youth justice system. We can reduce the growth rate of the criminal justice system. So I think that we would see all of those very positive effects occurring in the economy.
This idea certainly has had some bipartisan champions over the years. I think of Art Eggleton, a Liberal senator, former mayor of Toronto. I think of Hugh Segal, former Conservative senator. Politics is always about the art of the possible, so let's finish up on this. Do you think, at the end of the day, the politics of this country are such that it's actually possible to bring in a guaranteed annual income?
I think it's more possible now than I would have imagined at any time until now. When I look at the changes that have already been made to things like the National Child Benefit and the changes to the OAS GIS, I think this is the logical next step, the creation of a guaranteed annual income.
We'll continue to watch with interest. Evelyn Forget, it's so good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.